Okay, I think it's working. Kate Milafalcha. Welcome to anyone who might be here. I guess I have to turn this on. Okay, so I know that it takes a little while for people to show up, but it's late, and I just want to get right into this and see what the major issues were that they discussed and what I think the overall feeling of the debate was. I have to say, I was not impressed with Waltz. I thought his delivery was uncertain and a little bit muddled. I thought Vance was more rehearsed. He lied constantly, but that's what they do. So I would like to go over the issues that they covered one by one, the questions that the moderators asked. I think the moderators did a pretty good job. They got shouted down a couple of times because they're girls, but they did try. So let's start with the very first question was about the Middle East. Nothing like just jumping right into it, with Iran attacking Israel and the U.S. being there with equipment and people. They asked Tim Waltz first, would you support a preemptive strike from Israel on Iran? And he gave a confused answer. He talked about October 7th. He talked about Israel has the fundamental right to defend itself. Made a good point about Trump being too dangerous to make these sorts of decisions. And he started to list all these opponents of Trump, both Republicans and Democrats, people from his own administration who say he's unfit, including, he said, J.D. Vance. He says Harris is a calm presence. She knows that allies matter. And our allies look at Trump's relationship with things like North Korea and Putin, and it doesn't give them trust. Then they asked Vance, do you oppose or agree to Israel having the right to do a preemptive strike? And so, of course, immediately he says, well, let me introduce myself. And he tried very hard during this debate to make himself look like an ordinary guy. Oh, I'm just folks, just like you. I found his delivery to be smug and smarmy, polished, rehearsed, and full of lies. He avoided so many hot button things that he usually says in ordinary interviews, off the cuff remarks. He avoided them all. It was very slick, and it's unfortunate that Waltz didn't bring more of them up. We'll get to them as we go along. Anyway, he's trying to make himself seem like an ordinary guy, talking about his military experience and the American dream and his family's rough beginnings. He says, I know a lot of you are really worried, but we need better leadership to find the American dream. And then he launched into this discussion about Trump being a real believer in deterrence, that Biden unfroze Iran's assets. Iran used them to buy weapons. Trump believes that people need to fear the United States. He believes in peace through strength, and a preemptive strike would be up to Israel. So he didn't want to commit one way or the other. His narrative was that people should be afraid of the United States, and that's the image that we should put out there in the public. Now, I don't know if there's nobody looking at this or what's going on here. Well, I'm going to continue. Waltz's response was, look, Trump was in office, and when he was in office, he broke up the coalition that kept nukes out of Iran. And he wrote off the damage done by Iranian missiles to American troops when they got head trauma, brain trauma. He just wrote them off, laughed that off. he accused Trump of being fickle. He changes his story from one way to the next and said that, we need a coalition. We had a coalition, and Trump broke it up. Vance said the U.S. had a deal and Trump, Vance was asked, the U.S. had a deal and Trump exited from it. Did he make a mistake when he exited from it? And he said that Trump made the world more secure by his policies, that Iran and Hamas attacked Israel during the Biden administration. And when was the last time that a U.S. president didn't have a major conflict? It was when Trump was president. So then they changed the subject and they went on to the topic of Hurricane Helene, no relation, and climate change. And first they asked Vance, what would Trump do when 7 out of 10 Americans and more than 60% of Republicans want to address climate change? They believe it's a real thing and they want to do something about it. What would Trump do? And Vance starts kissing up to the survivors. It was really smarmy and it was really obvious. I found it off-putting. He said, when Trump is president, we'll put citizens first. Citizens. This is the returning theme of this whole entire debate on the part of Vance was everything's the fault of immigrants. Cost of housing, the cost of food, inflation, urban crime, gun violence. It's all because of immigrants or illegals. He says these crazy weather patterns are just crazy, man. He says we support, meaning Trump, we support clean air and this weird science. This is a term he used the word weird strategically a number of times. I thought it was interesting. I think it was intentional to sort of turn that word, diffuse it and turn it back on the Democrats. They called the Democratic position on carbon emissions as weird science. And he said you want to have manufacturing in the U.S. because manufacturing overseas is not subject to environmental regulation. And Harris put manufacturing in China. I don't know for sure, but I think this should be fact checked because I don't think that's true. I think they tried. I think Biden, and it's always Harris's fault, not Biden's fault. She is the vice president after all. She doesn't set policy. I think they tried hard to bring manufacturing back into the United States and to make it difficult for businesses to be doing that overseas. Walz's answer was that, of course, this terrible storm is a tragedy. And he said he'd been working in a coalition of governors just to help. He said Trump calls climate change a hoax and jokes about having more beachfront property. And Walz cited Harris creating jobs. Those statistics are true. He said climate change is real and we really need to talk about sources of clean energy, and our solution is to reduce our impact on the environment, still creating jobs and switching alternative energies. And then they asked Vance, do you have a further comment? And do you believe that climate change is a hoax? And so he said that clean energy is a Democratic slogan. He kind of slid over the question. Clean energy is a Democratic slogan, and money for Chinese solar panels is what the Democrats are all about. He says we use all sorts of Chinese equipment to get our clean energy here in the States, which begs the question, what kind of pollution are they doing there? He didn't really say that, but that's what he was implying. He said that Harris raised the cost of energy. And he made a lot of accusations like that, putting economic things on Harris's head, violence on her head, housing on her head. And not only was he often wrong about his specific assumptions, like lack of jobs and millions and millions of illegal immigrants, but he was constantly taking every opportunity to blame Harris. Waltz's response was, this was my thought, my disappointment with Waltz was I knew what he was trying to say because I've listened to him often enough. And I know what the Democratic policies are. And he was having, I think, a lot of trouble organizing his thoughts. I would have too. But he was having a lot of trouble organizing his thoughts and having a lot of trouble making logical verbal connections between his ideas. So it sounded disjointed unless you already knew what he was talking about. Vance, on the other hand, was very smooth because he had this set of Republican talking points. They were lies, but that's what they were. So Walt says, we're responding for the future. We have to think about the future. And we're doing things like the infrastructure law, which mitigates the damage for the future. And I found something about this whole debate that was really difficult to watch and really disturbing was how condescendingly smug Vance was the entire time. Every time Walt said something, Vance just gave him this look of complete, I don't know what the right word is. It was just really disturbing to me. Patronizing, I guess I would call it. Anyway, then they got to the topic of immigration, and I believe this is really the top issue they talked about all night because Vance certainly thought it was. He brought it up constantly, as did Trump. They asked Vance, you guys have talked about a deportation plan using the military. Can you tell us how that's going to work? And he said, let's see here. Okay, never mind. He said, then they specifically asked him as a part of this plan if parents were not official, legal immigrants and the children were born here, would you separate the parents to deport them and keep the children here, separating families? And Vance said, we have a historic border crisis, and that's not true at all. Then he said this was created by Harris. Also not true, that they opened the floodgates to let in millions of illegal immigrants and drugs and guns. And he blamed Harris for the fentanyl crisis, which, by the way, those deaths have gone down. He said, we wanted to build a wall. We wanted to deport these illegals. And he said, at least 1 million of them are absolute criminals already, and that we need to deport them first. There's just so many lies here, and make it harder for migrant workers to undercut the wages that are paid to American workers, which is a very odd approach to the fact that people who hire immigrant workers often pay them less because they're immigrant workers and they can get away with it. And Americans don't want the jobs of stooping in the fields, pulling lettuce out for very, very little money. Not talking about the true context of the issue at all. Then he said there's 320,000 kids lost by the Harris administration's Open Borders program. And he talked about trafficking, and he talked about drug mules. And this is this narrative that Trump is often pushing that's full of lies and full of holes. And unfortunately, there was no fact checking in this debate, which was really too bad. Walt said, fentanyl's a crisis, but last year there were far fewer deaths. There was the largest decrease in the number of deaths. It's getting better. And he said, Harris is the only person in this campaign or this, race on either side who's actually prosecuted drug criminals. Walt said, we had a bill. We had a border bill. Everybody agreed on it. It was bipartisan. The border law enforcement wanted it. They asked for it. And Trump said, no, don't pass it. He told Mike Johnson, don't pass it, wait. Let's make it a campaign issue for me and I'll pass it when I'm elected. Vance had nothing to say about that. Then he pointed out you need the legislature. The executive branch can't do these kinds of things. You need the legislature, and they tried. Trump had the ability to do something for 4 years. Where's his wall? And where's the money Mexico was supposed to pay for a wall? He said, really, what we have here is Trump dehumanizing people. And he says to Vance, pass the bill. Vance is the senator. Pass the bill. Harris will sign it. You'll get what you want. He didn't have anything to say about that. So then the moderators asked Vance again, will you separate children? And he said, well, we already have that with Harris's, circular logic with Harris's open borders, using children as drug mules. And he blamed Harris for all of it again. And he said that the Harris administration, I don't know where Biden went. He's out of the picture. The Harris administration revoked 94 Trump executive actions that, by doing that, she opened the border. And he blamed immigrants for everything. It was just really hard to listen to. Then the next question was more than 50% of Americans support mass deportations. I just thought that was a shocking number to hear. That really upset me. Walt said, well, Trump is demonizing and vilifying people that are here legally. And Trump's making this an issue, making Springfield this big thing and a talking point and dehumanizing people. And then they asked Vance, do you agree or disagree that Congress holds the power over the money to do something? And Vance, he's so smooth. Oh my God, it was really hard to watch. He's a psycho, total psychopath, allegedly. He says, just give law enforcement what they need. Hello, they tried to, and your running mate stopped it. He said about Springfield, Waltz is worried about the millions of illegal immigrants that are destroying citizens' lives because of Harris's open borders. And Waltz said, well, law enforcement wants the bill. And once again, Vance is bringing up this issue to blame migrant workers. Waltz pulled out the Bible, he used the Bible card. The Bible from Matthew, do whatever you do to the least of my brethren. Vance didn't bat an eye. Waltz talked about the dignity of how we treat other people, and then there was a little bit of a heated back and forth there for a second, and they were talking over the moderators who were trying to change the subject because time was up. Vance was interrupting and explaining how the legal status of these people was suspect because he didn't like how it was done. He just doesn't like having them here. So they asked about the economy. I wrote, he won't shut up, and they cut the mics. They asked about the economy. And they wanted Waltz to explain Harris's tax credits. Wouldn't that lead to a deficit? The Wharton School, I didn't get the amount of money that it would lead to a deficit of, but he explained their plan, and he said it would lower the price. I don't think he did a very good job of talking about the economy. Sort of muddled thinking and non-connected ideas. He threw a lot of stuff out there. I knew what he was getting at, but he didn't make a clear argument. She lowered drug costs. She increased the number of houses and lowered the cost. This is all part of her plan. It's not done yet. And helping small businesses. And he did say something really important. He said, what we have here is a philosophical difference. He says, Trump wants to give the rich a tax cut, and he's fine with increasing the national deficit. And he also wants to increase the sales tax. But meanwhile, the wealthy are getting away scot-free, and the country's going more into debt. And Harris just wants the wealthy to pay their fair share. I thought that was well put. And then they asked Vance. Wharton School says that Trump's plan would balloon the deficit. And Vance immediately avoided the question and said, well, you won't hear that Harris has done this for 3 years. She's in the job for 3 years. Why hasn't she done something? She has raised the cost of food. She's raised the cost of housing by opening the southern borders. Don't trust her plans. You can't trust what she promises because she hasn't done it. And he said these experts, you can't listen to them. They don't have common sense. He said when Trump was president, he brought in increase in income, wages for people, and peace and security. And let's move on. So I started this. He said Trump made tax cuts and the resources went to the middle class. That's not entirely true. He cut the taxes of the rich, and he never paid his own taxes. Cut the taxes of the rich. They told people that they were getting a benefit from that, and they gave them a lump sum up front, but nothing more. They got like $700, $800, and that was it. But they want to say, you got rich, you got money handed to you from the government, and people remember, oh yeah, we got a check from the government. He must be telling the truth. But it was a drop in the bucket. It didn't continue. Meanwhile, Trump hasn't paid taxes. So he says, common sense wisdom, Trump will bring it back. Waltz said, COVID collapsed the economy, and I don't know exactly why he made that argument because it gets Trump off the hook. He says, Trump, meanwhile, says you can't trust science, you can't trust experts, you can't trust economists. But how is it fair that Trump hasn't paid his own taxes? He says, we just want fairness. And I wish he had gone into that part more. Vance said, well, we could Trump brought manufacturing back to the United States. And he mentions his beautiful little children. Several times throughout this debate, he got all beatific and smarmy and talked about his beautiful wife and his beautiful children. The only interaction we know of between Vance and his children was when he was in a hotel room with his son trying to make an important phone call, and he screamed at his son to shut up because I'm on the phone. Anyway, Watts said, why do voters trust Trump on the economy? Trump created the largest trade deficit that we've ever had. And the people who profited, and he looks at Vance and says, were the venture capitalists, which is what Vance was. Harris did bring jobs home. And then Vance got very real patronizing, real smug, I really didn't like what I was seeing. He accused Waltz of playing whack-a-mole, defending Harris's atrocious economic record. He made a direct appeal to the poor. I know what it's like. I struggled, and trying to be a man of the people. It's pretty obnoxious. So then they changed the question to the issue of personal qualifications to be vice president, because you have to advise the president. And this was a real Waltz fail. I think this was his weakest moment during the debate. They said to him that you have made claims that you were at Tiananmen Square in China when that whole student revolution happened. And, what was that about? He tried to get out of it without saying, oh, I misspoke. And he finally admitted at the end that he misspoke. What he was talking about was that he had been back and forth to China many times. He and his wife, teaching high school, had made all these trips with students as cultural exchange, and had been in China for multiple times within the 6 months after Tiananmen Square happened. And he tried to deflect rather than just say, oh yeah, I misspoke, and then said what I just said. I was there immediately in the aftermath. I saw the remains of what happened. He said I got caught up in my own rhetoric, and he tried to turn the whole thing on Trump, and he finally did say he misspoke. I wish he'd been clearer and just said, yeah, I misspoke about that. I was there, but I wasn't there that day where the tank tried to run over the guy. I was there multiple times in the next 6 months. And so I got to experience what it was like for the people. That would have been a much cleaner approach to it. Then they asked Vance, in 2016, you called Trump unfit, and you called him the American Hitler. And you wrote posts against Trump's economic decisions. Why should Americans believe that you'll give Trump the advice that he needs and not the advice he wants? And he said, I was wrong about Trump. And he mentioned a few things, and I changed my opinion on him. And, I just need to explain to the American people that I evolved and changed my opinions. He says the Democrats, all of a sudden, this is now a Democratic problem. His Democrats weren't governing because they were impeaching, and we need to stand up for ourselves. So I don't know what that was about. Then they talked about reproductive rights, and that was also not strong enough. They asked Waltz, the accusation is that Democrats want abortion in the 9th month and then let a child die after it's born if the abortion, produces a breathing child. And so Waltz immediately goes, well, that's not true. That's not what the law says. And then he changes the subject. I wish he would have gone more into that. He started mentioning women who had died, somebody in Texas, 12-year-old girl in Kentucky who, and he said, Vance has said that two wrongs don't make a right about, if you're raped, and then, women should be in charge of their own health care. And I think he said that strongly, and he said it clearly, but I wish he had elaborated more. He said, take, Project 2025. They want to get rid of contraception. They want to get rid of IVF and let the states decide. And that's not how this works. This is a basic human right. And maternal deaths and maternal health care are really bad in this country. So then they asked Vance, will you do a registry of pregnancies, tracing the menstrual police? And he said, a woman I'm really close to that I love very much had an abortion. And I want to protect life. And we must earn people's trust. Republicans must be pro-family. I had the hardest time with Vance's responses in this part. He said, we support fertility, want to give women more options. Trump thinks it's a big country with different viewpoints and we should let the states decide. And they asked Waltz, there are diverse states, there are a lot of opinions. Waltz says, well, you're ignoring the part where a woman lives in a state where she can't get care, has to travel to another state to get care and dies along the way, which has happened. So they asked Vance, do you support a national ban? And why have you changed your position? So he goes on about a partial birth ban, which is not a thing. That's not a thing. And Democrats' radical approach, and we need to win people's trust. Women see pregnancy as a thing to destroy their income, a threat to their standard of living, basically saying, there won't be any need for abortion if women get better pay, or I don't know quite what he was implying there. Waltz said, we're pro women's freedom, we're pro make your own choice, make having kids more affordable, sure, childcare and cost of family living. Vance went into botched late term abortions, and doctors don't have to save the baby after it's born. And what about Catholic hospitals? Would you force them to do something against their religious beliefs? And at this point, I think it was really getting under Waltz's skin. He said, he's distorting the way the law is written. That's not how the law is written. But he didn't really do a good job of talking about how the law was written. But what I hated about this entire exchange was the many demeaning things Vance has said about women, the many retro approaches he's taken to family life, like women should stay home and have children. Grandparents should take care of kids. That'll solve the child care problem. Just get your grandparents to take care of children. Excuse me? I've served my time. Um, and it was a complete misrepresentation. There is no such thing as a partial birth abortion. And what the law says, let me just explain here. What this law says is, um, you give an abortion and the baby is alive. What do you do? And they said, well, you don't do dramatic life-saving techniques. You make the baby comfortable. You give it palliative care and let it die, because in these cases, the abortion has happened because the baby really is not survivable. The baby either has really dramatic defects of some sort, or anencephalic, when these babies that are born without brain, a brain stem and nothing else. This does happen. This is really a tragedy, and they may live a few days, but you make them comfortable. You don't kill them. That's not what they're saying at all. Okay, then they asked Vance, you oppose legislation for gun control legislation. This is the next topic. And some parents have recently been convicted when their children have committed mass shootings. Do you think that this would curb mass shootings? And he says, the greatest answer of the whole night, well, sometimes yes and sometimes no. So then he talks about his children again, which is just smarmy. He says, we do have to do better, but how? And the majority of violence is committed by illegal guns coming across Harris's open border. That's her fault, Nobody talked about, well, let's discuss these particular mass shootings and see what illegal guns were involved. And you come to find out that they weren't illegal guns. They were perfectly legal, registered guns, but they belonged to a parent or a family member or whatever. So to protect schools, he thinks that you should turn schools into an armed camp with law enforcement and increased security. And Walt says, listen, I own guns, I support the Second Amendment, and I believe our first responsibility is children. We can't even get the research done about this issue to discover what the reasonable things are that we could do, because they're opposing doing the research. He says what we really want to do is make the correct decisions about reasonable legislation and control. He says, do you really want your children's schools to feel like a fort? He says, we can make a difference if we take certain steps, but we have to approach this in a logical way, and we can't because they're obstructing. Vance says, okay, this is great. Walt says, my own son was at something and witnessed a shooting, and implying he was traumatized by it. Vance's response was, Christ have mercy. Thoughts and prayers. And then once again, he talks about weird differences. He says there's a high rate of mental health problems, a mental health crisis in the country, and it's a big piece of it. I don't know. This is a very nuanced topic, and I would love to get into it. I actually have a book prepared that I'm reluctant to get into because the author of the book had to go into hiding from angry young men. So I don't know. I should talk about it. But in the meantime, there's a whole topic of young men being militarized, desensitized, turned into misogynists through the internet intentionally. The other reason, he says, the other reason we have such a high rate of gun violence is urban gun violence. Urban is a code word. You know what urban stands for. That's a code word. And he says, we need to empower our law enforcement. Yeah, that's exactly what we need. And Waltz was asked, you changed your position on guns. Why did you do that over the years? And he said, well, because of the gun violence. He said, I sat in a room with parents of the Sandy Hook children. That's why I changed my position. I saw what it did to real people. And he said this urban violence thing is a misrepresentation. He said really the highest rate of gun violence occurs in rural suicides. There's an epidemic of it, and it's not in the urban areas at all. This is a stereotype that they're pushing. He says mental health is a scapegoat. And he said we can find solutions. Now, I wouldn't say necessarily a scapegoat. I do think it's one of the problems. But, you know, the ubiquity of guns in this country is just a mental health issue in and of itself. That's just me talking. Okay, the next thing they wanted to talk about was the high cost of housing and the low availability of houses. And Waltz was confronted with, you know, you guys have made promises about giving a down payment assistance for housing and building more homes and, you know, giving money to offset the high cost of housing. So where are you going to get the money and where are you going to get the land to build the homes? And he said something that's very true. He said, this is the problem is that people see housing as a commodity. What I wish he would have said in the next breath was having shelter is a human necessity and a human right. And it's our obligation as a country to make sure every person in this country has a roof over his or her head. But then he went on to talk about, you know, I lived in the same house for 4 years and my mother's lived in the same house and, you know, equating a house with a home. And he said we need to invest in housing by cutting red tape. Well, for example, giving veterans home loans where they don't have to pay a down payment up front. And owning a home creates generational wealth, and stable housing helps people get stable jobs. And he said it's not the immigrants' fault. They're trying to make it sound like, well, these immigrants come in and they get help from the government and it raises the price of rent and it raises the price of housing. And it's all the immigrants' fault because of Harris's border policy, ergo. And then they asked Vance, you've made the promise that you're going to seize federal lands to build houses and you're going to remove taxes. And so, you know, where are you going to build these houses and what kind of immediate relief is that going to be? And he says, well, you have to blame Harris for the cost of the houses. Illegals are competing, and that's why homes cost so much. And why hasn't Harris done anything yet? She's been in office for 3 years and she's doing nothing except campaigning. He says we need to lower energy prices. Part of the problem is it costs so much to pay for energy. The gas that goes into the trucks that brings the lumber to build the houses is one of the examples he gave. He goes, I agree with Trump. Drill, baby, drill. And the costs are too high in housing because of the energy. And so then they asked him again, so where do you get the federal lands? And his answer is unused federal land and kick out the illegal immigrants. But if it's unused, there's no land. It's just bizarre. Anyway, they asked Waltz, and he said, you know, this accusation that she's letting in immigrants, millions and millions of criminal immigrants, is not true. And he says, okay, how are you going to drill on federal land and build on federal land? He says, and I don't understand what land, because when we have a shortage of housing in Minneapolis, there's no federal land around Minneapolis to build extra houses on. And he really had the ability to make reference to policies and plans and projects and programs, things they've actually done as being governor of Minnesota. I don't know if that really landed strongly enough. He said people see housing and federal lands as a commodity, and it's not. Vance says there is evidence that migrants bring up the house prices, and he started to blame regulations on building and development. He said development is harder because of all these regulations, and giving houses to people who are here illegally. Waltz retaliated with the whole thing about, well, Congress writes the regulations if you let them. And he says, you know, you want regulations. You want to be able to get out of your house if it's on fire, you know, sprinkler systems and stuff. There's a lot of regulations you have to have in building. You don't cut building regulations, you know, to make houses more affordable. Here, live in this cardboard shack, and here's a pack of matches. Anyway, And then they moved on to the high cost of health care. And to Vance, they said you wanted to replace Trump want to replace the ACA. And Trump claims he has a concept of a plan. And what about pre-existing conditions? And Vance says, well, of course we'll cover pre-existing conditions. Yeah, you get a car and you get a car. It's just, he said some of the most outrageous things. He says the concept of plans, you guys like to point that comment out. He says, but we don't want to get into the whole thing here on a debate stage, God forbid. So he says we need things like price transparency and lower drug costs. And Trump implemented all kinds of regulations. He worked to keep access to the Affordable Care Act, and he's earned the right to put in better policies. I'm not sure what that meant. Waltz said the truth of the matter is that more people have gotten insurance coverage under the Biden administration. That's absolutely true. And Trump ran on repealing the ACA, but the only thing that saved it was John McCain. And that's absolutely true. You can see it on video. And up here, right here, I wrote in the margin, Vance is so smug, I can't take it. Because while Waltz is talking and he's kind of stumbling over he's doing the kind of job I would do in this sort of a debate, tripping over his own words. His ideas were a little disjointed. It helped if you already knew what their position was. I don't know how it sounded to people who don't know much about him. He wasn't crystal clear. Vance was crystal clear. It was all lies. Lies and paranoia and espousing violence and patriarchy. Waltz said all kinds of really good things, but it was kind of muddled. So Vance says, Waltz said, this Trump policy lets insurance companies pick who they cover. So, if you have asthma, too bad. And you have something else wrong with you, too bad. If you're a woman, probably won't get covered for a lot of things. And Vance says, we have protections in place. And Waltz goes, that's not true. He was getting really frustrated. He said a lot of young people left the plan because it just wasn't worth it. Vance says, the Democrats claim all these bad things. He's listing all these bad things that they claim. But Trump saved the ACA, and inflation went down and wages went up, and Harris was responsible because of the borders. Okay. And this ended with Waltz saying Harris negotiated a better situation, so whatever. And then they want to talk about families and childcare. Not once did Vance say get your grandparents to babysit. I just have to put that out there. To Waltz, they said your day number one priority, you guys had claimed, would be childcare, family leave, some kind of federal family leave program. And how long would you allow people to stay home? I wish he would have said, in Scandinavia, people stay home a year, both parents, a year paid leave after they have their children, paid for by the federal government. And they managed to not collapse as a society. But what Waltz says was, it's negotiable. He says big companies already do it because they have enough employees and enough money to do it. And Minnesota implemented it, copying these big companies, because a lot of them are in Minnesota because we have a lot of healthcare facilities here. And he named a bunch of companies. And he said, the state government of Minnesota was able to put in a state leave plan. And he made a good point. He said Trump's economy is for the wealthy, and he really needs to work for all families. And so he said, yes, there should be paid family leave. And he said they would negotiate how long that would be for. So then they asked Vance, do you support family leave? And then he got all gross and smarmy about his children and his beautiful wife again. And this is not how he talks about them. He talks about his wife as a character in an Anais Nin novel. It's not a flattering thing to say. Anyway, he says we should make choice possible. And there's a difference there between Trump and Harris. They're really promoting choice of insurance companies. And then also, what they didn't talk about, and this drives me crazy, is that Trump and Vance don't like paying for official daycare with licensed daycare people who get good pay and benefits. And then it's regulated so that, they have to meet certain nutritional standards and health standards and background checks, et cetera, et cetera. What he wants is like, oh, churches can do it and groups of friends can get together and do it. And he didn't say grandparents, but he has in the past. And I wrote, he's not telling the truth. So then he tried to fix this whole tariff comment that Trump made when he said that we'll charge tariffs and we'll use that money to pay for childcare. And Vance is challenged by the moderators who said, Trump has made the claim that childcare is not expensive. And then he talked about giving a $5,000 childcare tax credit. And the whole time he's talking about this, Vance is just standing there with this psychopathic. It's called Duper's Delight. It's this smug smile that psychopaths have because they just think they're so much smarter than everybody else. It's the self-satisfied look on his face. It's just so difficult to watch, allegedly. So he talked about penalizing people who went overseas for jobs, like factory business owners, and that they'll take that money and use that for childcare and cut taxes, increasing tariffs, and that would pay for family leave. And I wrote, this makes no sense. Editorializing. Then they asked Waltz, will Congress agree to money to support your child care credit program? And he said, well, we're talking about $5,000 upfront credit on taxes. He says, that barely covers 3 months of child care. We really have to change the whole system. And he says, tariffs are not going to help anything. They have tariffs. Who do you think gets the tariffs? And he didn't make this really clear. I knew what he was saying. The purchaser, the consumer pays the tariff. The tariff is passed on in the cost of what you're buying. He didn't make that clear. Even I know that. He didn't make that clear. He said tariffs won't pay for anything. It's going to cost people $7,000 more a year. The cost goes to the consumers. And I really wish he would have harped on that a whole lot more. But, there you go. Then they asked about democracy. And they tried to make the point that there was no voting fraud in 2020. There were all these 60-plus court cases, and there was no voting fraud. And Trump lost them all. And they asked Vance, you have said that you would not certify votes the way that Pence did. That would be unconstitutional. Would you certify the votes this year if it was up to you? And his response was, let's focus on inflation. He said Trump believes there were problems in 2020, and now we have all these negative policies because of Harris, and the threat is censorship. That's the real threat. Harris wants to censor misinformation. She wants to censor, how did he put it? Oh, he's talking about the internet. And he said, I'm proud to say that I've been endorsed by Robert Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard. Don't tell Nate. And they're supporting me, and I'm very proud of that because they're former Democrats. And he says, this is becoming a little not coherent. Harris is engaged in censorship, and this is a bigger threat to democracy than anything. And Waltz is asked, and he says, Trump refused to admit he lost. So let's get down to it, And he said Trump's words matter. He talked about imprisoning opponents, and he talks about not admitting that he lost and wanting to overturn the election. He didn't make a clear argument. He had the strands of a clear argument, but it wasn't clear. If you knew where he stood, you understood what he was saying, but he didn't make it totally clear, I don't believe. I agreed with him, but I wish he had been more cogent. He says, now we're back in the same boat, and they're talking about the fraud, and there's no fraud, and he says this has to stop. And Vance said the Democrats say that Trump is a unique threat, but he gave up his administration peacefully. He said for years, Democrats have protested elections. Hillary Clinton said that Putin bought that election. And Waltz says this is revisionist history, which you know what that means. I know what that means, but a lot of people don't know what that means. And I wish he had been more clear about it. I said, January 6th, Vance had mentioned that, you're criticizing Trump for Facebook ads. That's not right. And Walt says, January 6th was not Facebook ads. Censorship is not stopping the threat. Censorship is book burning. Stopping threats on the internet isn't censorship. Stopping threats on the internet is stopping threats. I didn't think he made that very clear either. He said Trump is a threat to democracy. And I wrote, Vance won't answer. So, interestingly enough, Waltz turned to him and said, well, that's a damning non-answer. I like that. And then I wrote, Vance is a weasel, allegedly. So they want to reject censorship, according to Vance. And Waltz says, I'm shocked. And what he's shocked about is Vance would not answer. Did Trump lose the last election? He wouldn't answer. And Waltz says, I'm shocked. And I think this is the moment in the debate where, yikes. So then they had their closing, and Waltz had to go first, and he made these points that democracy matters. Harris had a coalition. They're optimistic. They have an opportunity economy. They want freedom for everyone to be able to make their own choices. He says, we know who Trump is. Vance supports Trump's agenda. Trump makes people afraid. Harris is all about joy and helping the middle class, and we want to look towards a new day. Vance said, let's talk about energy. He says, we're rich enough to have heat. He described his grandmother being cold in the winter because she couldn't afford heat. He said, we're rich enough to have heat. Harris policies make energy costs too high, food too high, housing too high, safety less safe, drugs worse. This is all lies. I'm writing lies, lies, lies. She's been vice president for 3 years, and her policies have made everything worse. Lies. He said, we have the greatest country, but we don't have any dreams because of broken leadership, and we need change. And he ended with, God bless you. So this was painful. This was really, I believed, a painful display of lies. But Vance was slicker about his lies. You would have to have had some knowledge of a lot of the things that he was claiming to understand where he was lying and what he was lying about. They lied about immigrants. They lied about crime. They lied about gun violence. They lied about choice. They completely ignored the topic of the LGBTQ community. I noticed that. Trump made the accusation the other day that you send your child to school in the morning, and while they're in school, they do sex change operation on him, and he comes home a different gender. This, honest to God, that's what Trump said. It's not what I said. I don't believe that. Duh. So he lied about what their plans are for immigrants. They lied about, because he's talked about rounding people up. He wants to round people up. There's a great new podcast. If you haven't seen it, haven't listened to it, it's about Project 2025. It's based on a book. I'll try to put a link to it, or at the bottom of this. It's a fictionalized version of what it would be like, and they use a woman having IVF, and then they use a kid who was brought over from Egypt as an infant, never actually, like a dreamer, right? But they've only gotten 2 episodes so far, and they're absolutely riveting and chilling, and I think you should watch it and listen to it. It's a podcast. So I don't think I had any questions. I don't think anybody's watching. I think people maybe were depressed about this. However, this was a very good experience for me because I got to do the technical part. Oh, now one person's watching. Whoever you are, who are you? You should comment. I'm the only person watching. And I'm done. I've discussed the whole entire debate. And as I said, I have real mixed feelings about it. I think Vance lied and lied and lied and was slick and smug and patronizing. Waltz was not as organized as his delivery needed to be. He told the truth, except for when he talked about being in China, and he should have been more forthright about that. I would say if you go based on truth, it was a draw. If you go based on delivery, Vance did better. And if you go based on likability, we can't even use that in the same sentence with the name Vance. Anyway, I'm going to upload this as a recording, and as such, thank you for not watching and torturing me because I don't know how to do the comments. And, you know, if you have comments, I would be really interested to know how people felt about this. So thank you, and slán go fóill, sláinte.